and Chelmsford and 12 staff officers and an escort party of 24 men basically gallop out to join Dartle at Mangini Falls. They ride into the area of Mangini Falls at about 6:30 that morning. When they get into the area of Mangini Falls, there are no Zulus to be seen. Approximately 45 minutes later, Colonel Glynn arrives with the head of the infantry column. Just before they march into the area of Mangini Falls, in the order of 4,000 to 4,500 Zulus are spotted on the high ground to the east. They're in a very strong position. Lord Chelmsford immediately realises that if he puts an infantry assault from the front, he's going to incur many casualties. He decides what he's got to try and do is try and get round behind them. So what he does for the moment is he leaves Colonel Glynn with the infantry at Mangini Falls, and Chelmsford sets off with this mounted force. 12 staff officers, an escort party of 24 men, and 120 mounted Imperial infantry cells on horseback. Lord Chelmsford has been outgeneralled by the Zulus. So we now have Lord Chelmsford sitting behind that flat top mountain at 8 o'clock in the morning, believe it or not, having his breakfast. The second thing he did was send a young officer who was 20 years old at the time, a man by the name of Smith Dorian, back to the camp at Rorke with a dispatch for this man, Colonel Durnford. Durnford's donor. Tell Colonel Durnford to move from Rorke with his 450 mounted pursuit soldiers, plus a 10-man rocket battery. Don't get too excited about the rocket battery, to a place called the Match-and-Armour Hills, same area as Mangini Falls. He's been spotted to the north of the camp. Lord Chelmsford receives that dispatch, still sitting behind that flat-top mountain at 9:30 in the morning, still having his breakfast. Whereupon he sends a man called Lieutenant Berkeley Milne, Royal Navy, goes on to be an admiral in the First World War, up on top of that flat-top mountain with his naval telescope to look back across the plain to see what's going on. It's been pouring with rain here for 10 days, and now it's a stinkingly hot day of 42, 45 degrees. There's a great haze across this plain, and Berkeley Milne can't see too much. All he can really see is the outline of the British camp, hundreds of little white tents, and all the tents are standing. There's a standing order in the British Army, most Western armies today, that if you have a tented camp, and the tented camp is about to be attacked or has been attacked, the very first order you give is to strike your tents, knock your tents down. You just take about 1 minute, or you just kick out the centre pole and the tent will fold. You do it for two very good reasons. One, you don't want enemy force getting behind your tents and firing your own troops in the front. The second reason used to be a signal to those troops outside. Camp is about to be attacked, you strike your tents, hopefully those men outside would notice and promptly return. It appears that nobody gives the most basic of orders here, to strike the tents. The battle at this stage has not started, but at 1 o'clock, when Chops on the twin laconic hole 10 miles out, that's all he can see of the tents standing. Berkeley Milne sits on top of that flat top mountain for just over 1 hour, peering back across his plain. Rides down the back of the mountain and obviously tells Chelmsford, all I can see are the tents standing. He now selects Mangini Falls as his second base camp. And he sends a man called Captain Gardner back to this camp with a dispatch for the camp commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Pillane, to tell Pillane to break camp and to move this entire contingent to Mangini Falls. But time and distance, Rorke here is 10 miles, 10 days. That's 13 miles. It can take 13 days. That horse them back up on top of the Mangargan Knoll to rejoin the picket to see what the Zulus are doing, where they've gone. I know you've already got it. The Zulus are trying to confuse the British, and they've succeeded. When he rejoins the picket, all they can see is between 6,000 and 7,000 Zulus now withdrawing to the northeast. They're 4 miles away and they're still going. Horseman rides back down the camp and tells Pillane the Zulus have gone. Pillane stands the camp down. The soldiers go off to finish their breakfast. They're told to keep their packs on. They're told to hang on their rifles. But basically they've been stood down. During the next 2 to 2.5 hours, pockets of Zulus, large pockets of Zulus, are spotted moving across the top of the Nuta Plateau, from west to east, from east to west. West is back towards Rorke. The movement of the Zulus to the west alarms Lieutenant Chard, and Chard now decided to leave his camp earlier than he had intended. He starts to ride back towards Rorke. Purely coincidentally, when Chard left this camp, Pullein brought it back in its fighting position. Chard bumps into Colonel Durnford, approximately half a mile to the west of the mountain. He briefs Durnford on the movement of the Zulus to our north. Durnford now basically breaks away from his slow-moving rocket battery and his wagons. With his mounted force, he now gallops up the camp, where obviously once more he's briefed by Lieutenant Colonel Pullein. We are told by numerous historians there's an argument that occurs between these two officers at this point in time. I personally think that's highly unlikely. Perhaps in discussion what Durnford was saying to Pullein is, why on earth haven't you got any patrols out the north? It's fine having a picket, but a picket doesn't move, it can't see, and it does reappear from the north. I think what they might attempt to do is to attack Lord Chelmsford's column as it's going out. That must be the weakest point of the whole central column's advance at the stage. It must be spread over 2.5 to 3 miles, and it was. The further east you go up the plain, the more broken ground there is. Therefore, what I now intend doing is I'm going to send out 3 patrols. I'm going to send out a man called Lieutenant Roberts with 50 mounted men to the northwest. I'm going to send out a man called Lieutenant Charlie Rorke with 53 mounted men to the northeast. I'm going to send out a man called Captain George Shepston to pick up Lieutenant Barry's picket with that company of native troops now to patrol on the top of the Nutter Ridge. With me? I'm going to tell those officers that if they come across the Zulus on top of the Nutter Plateau, what they must attempt to do is try and sweep them off the plateau right to the eastern end of the Nutter Ridge onto the plain. As soon as my rocket battery arrives up here, my rocket battery, 4 tubes, open tubes, each tube 4 foot long, each one mounted to the back of his own donkey, escorted by a company of native troops. As soon as my rocket battery arrives up here, I'm going to leave this camp with my rocket battery and the balance of my mounted force, 120 mounted pursuiters. The moment that George Shepston got to the side of Pullein was the same moment that Captain Gardner came back from Lord Chelmsford to tell Pullein to break camp and to move to Mangani Falls. Pullein is totally confused. He turns around to Captain Gardner and says, Durnford has just told me the Zulus will not attack this camp. Captain Gardner turns around to Pullein and says, Sir, I suggest for the moment we ignore Lord Chelmsford's orders and we take note of what's happening to our north. From the point of view of this story up here at the moment, there are 3 important men in the camp. Lieutenant Colonel Pullein in command of the camp, George Shepston's come back from Charlie Rorke, as it were, and Captain Gardner's come back from Lord Chelmsford. They basically stand together. Let's really put ourselves in the picture again now. We all remember the movement of the Zulus to our west. We remember the picket that was, no longer, is now a company of native troops patrolling on the top of the Nutter Ridge. Pullein has lost his eyes. That valley area has now become dead ground. It's too close to this camp for Pullein not to know whether something's happening inside that valley area or not, specifically because of the movement of the Zulus to our west and the picket had been able to see in there. What he might have done is send 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 horsemen up on top of the spur. What he decides to do is take a full company of men out of his northern firing line. As you're looking from here, he takes the left-hand company under the command of a man called Captain Cavey. Sends Captain Cavey with his full company of men up on top of the spur. Now picture your building, you've got between 80 and 100 men dressed in scarlet in the heat of the day over 1 mile out of the camp. As you see that happening, the company of NNC that had been the picket flees. They've seen the Zulu army pouring across the plateau towards them. They run down the side of the cliff, the other side of the lodge here. When Pullein sees the company of NNC fleeing, believe it, he sends a second company out of his northern firing line. The centre company, under the command of a man called Captain Mostyn, up on top of the spur to support Cavey. We've now got approximately 200 men spread along the top of that spur for just over 1,500 yards. He's spreading his force, Zulu army is pointing towards him as opposed to putting it in. Keep them in your picture for a couple of minutes. Now we have to pretend that all these soldiers now look east. As they look east, they get the first sighting of the rocket battery, begin to clamber up the lower slopes of the Tuzi Heights. As they see the rocket battery, they get the first sighting of a column of Zulus. Zulu left-hand horn is going to come onto this battlefield in 2 sections. This is the Tuzi Valley. Left-hand horn is camped up here that night. They come down the Tuzi Valley, they're going to split. What becomes known as the inside column comes over the top of the Tuzi Heights. The outside column comes straight down the Tuzi Valley. So we've got, as the rocket battery beginning to clamber up the lower slopes of Tuzi Heights, and as where they look up, and what do they see? They see the inside column of Zulu left-hand horn, about 2,500 Zulus, standing on top of the Nutter Ridge, peering down upon the rocket battery. Keep them in your picture for a second. Dermot's gone round the back of the Conacher Hill. Finds himself in the Toosey Valley. He's proceeded up the Toosey Valley for about half a mile when he's confronted by the outside column of the Zulu left-hand horn, another 2,500. Dermot immediately beats a retreat. He fights a retreat out of the valley. Mentally see Dermot 4 miles away from us, right up against this cliff, riding towards us. When the Zulus are above the rocket battery, the inside column see Dermot coming back. They leave the top of the neutral ridge like a huge black snake and they pour down towards the rocket battery, moving at a colossal speed of 10 to 14 miles an hour, shouting their war cries. The war cries must attract all these soldiers in the camp, and now watching Major Russell try and set up his rocket battery, a diabolical piece of equipment, a precursor to the modern-day mortar. Each one of these rocket tubes, 4 foot long, open tubes, has to be set up in his own bipod. It's only now the Zulu commander, Tetswai is his name, 71 years old, a big bone man. He's run the whole way here from Malundi where the King's Crown was, 55 miles with Zulu warriors. He's standing on top of the Yeni Rock behind you. It's only now that he can see that his left and right hand horn are virtually in position does he allow his head and his chest, those warriors found by Charlie Roar, to appear on the top of the neutral ridge. From the highest spot, the Mangaga Knoll, for 2 miles on the top of this neutral ridge, those 10,000 Zulu warriors are going to form up and sweep down this camp. 5, 7.5, 10. As they leave this ridge, their positions now are taken by between 10 to 15,000 Zulu maidens. They're not all maidens, many young men. The carriers of extra spears and bedding rolls, called Ndubi boys. They're all going to stand on top of this neutral ridge throughout this battle, shouting, screaming, and of course ululating the men to battle. The noise on this battlefield must be something absolutely devastating. This plain is a catchment area for noise because of the rock. At the eastern end of the Zulu assault off the top of the neutral ridge is what is known as the Young's Regiment. Young only because of one reason. King Shaka, 60 years prior to this, had made it a law within the Zulu nation that every male had to wash his spear in somebody else's blood, prior to being allowed to make an approach to the king to ask permission to get married. Marriage is a privilege, not a right. That Young's regiment never washed their spears. So they swoop down for southern slopes of the neutral ridge. They're going to get themselves stuck in that flail swamp area. Have the heavier firepower they pour into that swamp area. Now they're supported by the 2 7-pounders. Slowly but surely, that Young's regiment, battered and bruised they were, begins to stagger and starts to fall back towards the neutral ridge. Zulu history tells us the Zulus have never been able to afford to have the head and the chest portion of the assault split. Zulu history tells us that when that Young's regiment started to fall back, the whole Zulu assault from the north started to fall back towards the neutral ridge, at which point in time the Zulu command structure on the top of the Yeni Rock thought they'd lost this battle. When they suddenly see another old Zulu, 71 years old, with a little grey beard, a man by the name of Umkasana. Umkasana was the Induna, the chief of that Young's regiment. He's seen running off the southern slopes of the neutral ridge. He runs straight down the middle of that swamp area. As he got in the swamp area, he shouted an order. The king never told you to retreat, you will advance. Whereupon he's probably shot dead by the British. Somehow or other, that Young's regiment get themselves out of that swamp area and begin to stagger forward. And when that happens, the whole Zulu assault of the north once more start to advance. As far as Zulu history is concerned, all honour and glory for their victory here goes down to this man Umkasan for having given his life for the Zulu nation. Somehow or other, that Young's regiment get themselves out of that swamp area and begin to stagger forward. All together. You remember the picket? Remember it fled? They've got themselves down on the knuckle line now, about 150 yards in front of those guns. They're covering that quarter circle about 200 yards. The employment of these imperial soldiers, of these native troops, one-fold. They took it for granted the imperial troops would break the Zulus. Once the Zulus are running, they use the NNC to chase them. The Zulus themselves, they can move across the ground at the same speed. They are not supposed to be frontline troops. They're not trained for it, and they're not equipped for it. When that Young's regiment has been given the order, the king never told to retreat to in advance. They get themselves out of that swamp area and begin to stagger forward. In that moment of staggering forward, there is a colossal series of Zulu war cries that echoes along the whole advancing forces into the north. Who Sotu! The company of NNC on the knuckle line breaks. They run straight back to the knuckle line, straight back towards those 2 7-pounders, drawn by 4 horses. It's a fact that Major Smith and Lieutenant Curling, commanding those guns, had just hitched the horses of the gun carriages. The company of NNC now totally encircles the horses and the gun carriages. They hang on to the saddlery, hang on to the gun carriages. The big artillery horses go wild, and they start to drag the guns straight back to the middle of the camp, straight back towards the saddle.